Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get going. We have a couple folks in the waiting room and more probably coming, but we've got a pretty good group. So, hi everyone, and thanks for joining us. Bob, you can hear me, right?
You sure
Good,
can.
good. Just double checking. So I'm Andy Johnson with Clean Energy Districts of Iowa. Um, we are an association of county level clean energy districts. There are a dozen of those in Iowa, plus one in southwestern Wisconsin, so 13. And adding more every year. The clean energy districts really generally work at the local level, promoting a locally led and locally owned clean energy transition in their communities and in their counties. We also engage some on policies that help to promote that local clean energy transition and to allow local ownership and local economic benefits of that transition at the local level. So today's conversation, I want to thank Bob Rafferty for joining us. Part of the policy work that we've engaged in over the years at the Utilities Board include rate dockets. And as we all know, rates are going up, especially electric rates, especially in Alliant territory. And many of us are involved in the current rate case at the Utilities Board. One of the tools that we've been lacking for a long time in Iowa is integrated resource planning. That's a tool that allows state regulators to have and stakeholders and other stakeholders to have a better understanding of all the various investments that utilities make, which then get passed on to us ratepayers. And so we think, and many of our partners think, it's high time that Iowa seriously adopts some integrated resource planning tools and methodologies. The opportunity is here. The need is definitely here. And one of our really strong partners in this area of working at the state level towards grid reform in Iowa and grid improvements is Bob's group, Iowa Business for Clean Energy. Bob's been involved in both government and private business sector for over 30 years. He was a state legislator long ago. I don't know how long ago, but long ago. He's worked for both Republican and Democratic administrations in the state. And now one of his roles is leading this group, Iowa Business for Clean Energy. Bob's going to talk to us about integrated resource planning, what it is, what it could do for us, and why it matters now. And then we'll have hopefully a fairly healthy Q&A conversation. So Bob's presentation is going to be fairly short, his slideshow, maybe 15 or 20 minutes. As we go, you can put questions into the chat directed to me at Winneshiek Energy District in the chat, not to everyone, please. And then when it's time, we'll go ahead and be covering those questions, and we can have quite a healthy discussion if there are a lot of questions from you all. So without further ado, thanks for joining us, Bob, and take it away.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, so I serve as executive director for Iowa Business for Clean Energy. We're a nonprofit that was started a few years ago, and an interesting story, which I won't go into the details, but basically it was a business realizing thinking ahead 5 and 10 years as to what their business would be like, and then realizing that our current electric grid might really put them at a competitive disadvantage and what that might mean. And as we started really looking at the whole situation of the electric grid, we realized, holy cow, we have a structure that's based on something that was developed 100 years ago and hasn't really changed dramatically much, yet we're on the cusp of a significant revolution. And so when we started this a couple of years ago, we weren't we sort of started with a blank slate, but with a belief that we needed to really generate a good, healthy discussion and dialogue about how the grid's changing, and start a conversation of what do we need to do to create the type of reform to ensure we can have a clean and competitive electric structure for all communities moving forward. And one of the things that became real apparent was Iowa's lack of integrated resource planning. So let me just talk about kind of some of the basics of the grid, what's changing, how we currently regulate it at a high level, and it then kind of help explain and why it's integrated, something like integrated resource planning, which sounds why that forms the basis for the type of reform we're going to need. So here we have the residential rates for the two investor-owned utilities in Iowa, MidAmerican, Alliant. Between the two, they cover about 75% of the state, with RECs and the munis covering the remaining 25%. And that's based on energy use, not geography. But if you look at that, one of the challenges is Alliant's rate structure is significantly higher than MidAmerican's. And there is a number of reasons for that. There's not an easy solution. One in part is those in Alliant territory, which is spread out across the state, by the way, is disproportionately rural areas. And so that's going to cost more to supply. There's also several other reasons, such as a financial decision made by Alliant a number of years ago to sell their transmission, and other reasons. MidAmerican Energy is it has some competitive rates, as you can see. But nonetheless, if you're in an Alliant community and you're a business in Alliant, needing to ensure that in the long term you can be competitive is important. And I think it's important for us to set a goal that it can't happen overnight, but in the long term, how do we get to that? Ensure it to that place where all Iowa's communities can be energy competitive by 2040. So looking at the current regulatory structure, because this is important to understand, how does integrated resource planning or any rate reform, why is rate reform even necessary in Iowa? This structure, by the way, was established starting in the 1920s, coming out of Chicago, where it was the first effort to create a franchise/monopoly electric grid system. Before that, the electric grid was just developing. You'd have multiple companies putting up multiple electric lines in urban areas. Rural areas were being left out. And the electric company, Commonwealth Edison at the time, was able to buy up the competition and convince policymakers that it made more sense, rather than having multiple competing electric companies trying to build out this grid, which was very much in its infant stage, give them a monopoly, but then have a governing body that would help regulate the rates. At that point, those rates were structured based on three components. Allowable operational costs, so you'd have this government body reviewing that and ensuring those operational costs were within reason, as much as a small government body can do. Second, allow capital cost of capital investments, and that would be recovered on a depreciating schedule. And then the third component of the rate is the allowable profit. And because the grid was in its early stages and encouraged build out, that profit was based purely on a percentage of the capital assets that had been invested by the utility. That structure is still the same structure we're basically using today, with just a few small tweaks. And so that really forms the challenge we have, because the investor-owned utilities profits being based purely on a percentage of their capital assets, it's not based on the efficiency of the grid. And as we're going into this new world, this new grid, that's going to pose a challenge. So if you look at the grid of the past, as you can see, that type of rate structure made sense. You had some large generating facilities, typically coal or gas. Those would feed into the transmission and the distribution system, and that electricity would flow one way to the homes and businesses. But the grid of the future is a lot more complex. It's not only, you still have some of those large generating facilities, but then you have obviously the renewables, the wind, the solar that the utilities are putting in. But as we all know, we're seeing solar more and more on residential rooftops, at businesses, in government buildings. You're seeing not just solar, but as battery prices are going to come down over the next 10 years, we're going to see an explosion of batteries on the grid. That's going to be as especially true when it comes to our transportation. And this energy isn't just flowing from the utilities to the homes and businesses, but it's bidirectional. So that creates a much different grid, but an also more complicated grid. So let's take a look at kind of the energy use and start thinking, if I'm a utility, what do I need to do to ensure that the lights stay on, that we don't have the brownouts, that we don't have the blackouts? This chart that I'm showing here is a graph of the, this is the actual usage in as you see up top, it says the MISO zone 3 and 5. MISO is this regional market comprised, I should know how many states, approximately, I think there's 7 or 8 states within MISO, running from Minnesota down south. I believe the Louisiana is included. Illinois is part of that, Wisconsin, and Missouri. Zone 3 and 5 consists of Iowa and parts of that MISO district. So this is the daily energy usage. If you look at the orange line, the orange is the maximum amount of energy used in the peak hour of that day. And the blue line is the energy used during the lowest hour of the day. As you can see, there's about 10 days a year, and it's in the summer, it's on hot days, when we have peak energy use in Iowa. And as you can see, and I have another chart below, that peak energy use, and this chart here is actually from the use from the what is presumed probably the hottest day that year. That was the year 2022. And as you can see, our peak demand is only about 8 hours a day. It starts about noon to 2 o'clock, and it lasts till about 7 to 8 o'clock in the afternoon. So what that means is, as we look at a utility, making sure we don't have brownouts during these peak times, it's really only about 8 hours within those days. So we're looking at 80 hours approximately a year where we need to make sure we have enough capacity to meet the demand. And in fact, the gray line above is a rough rule of thumb target. Often they're trying to achieve a 20% cushion to ensure you don't have brownouts or blackouts. So for a utility, as you look into the future and project where how often and at what level those peaks are, you have to ask yourself, how are you going to ensure sufficient capacity of the grid? And there's multiple ways to do that. First, you can expand the capacity of both or all 3 components: this transmission, distribution, storage, and generation of the system. You can expand just the capacity of the transmission and distribution as far as the utility, but then the utility could purchase that generation via PPAs, a power purchase agreement, or via the MISO open market. And MISO is the one that will buy and trade energy among utilities. So those utilities that need energy at any particular time can purchase it off that market between the utilities, and obviously those who have excess generation can sell it. A third way is just to expand the behind the meter self-generation that you see on rooftops, as well as community solar and storage for that matter. Number 4 is we could invest in energy efficiency. And in fact, that's been demonstrable to show that certain energy efficiency programs can be less expensive than actually building out the grid, the transmission, distribution, and generation of the grid. And then a 5th way to meet that peak demand during those 80 hours is to provide incentives in regards to demand flexibility and demand response. This is where you provide incentives to homeowners and businesses to use energy at some other time than the 8 hours on that hot July day. One of the leading energy consulting firms a few years back came out with a study that projects by 2030, 20% of that peak demand that we're trying to build our grid to meet can be met through economic demand response programs, meaning it would be cheaper to incentivize people to use energy at a different time of the day than to build out the system. Now, the challenge with the structure we have is that as you look at those different strategies to achieve the electric grid that we need moving into the future, expanding the capacity by just building more transmission, distribution, and generation, that maximizes the profit of the investor-owned utility, but it's not necessarily the most efficient and lowest cost approach or even most reliable approach. The second, again, would increase the profit because, again, the only way an investor-owned utility increases its profits is to have more capital assets. So the challenge is the last three strategies, which in various given circumstances may be both the most reliable and least costly, can actually reduces the long-term profit potential of the investor-owned utility. So we've created this regulatory structure that is not set up to ensure that the investments that are being made, the decisions of how to meet our future electric grid, we can't be assured that that's in the ratepayer's best interest. We know that that's going to be in the utility's interest, any type of investments, but we can't know for sure it's in the ratepayers. And the reason and how it's structured today, in fact, our rates, right now, the utilities board only considers investments that the utilities bring to them to meet that future demand. So third parties don't really have a platform to come forward and say, hey, this is how we should meet that future demand. And there's no mechanism to allow that to happen. That is where, and before I get that, that is where integrated resource planning comes in. So let me talk about, there's different, this is the, actually I'm going to go just kind of move forward that from that slide. This is the reason, a key reason why the Iowa Utilities Board study that was conducted this past summer and fall really identified integrated resource planning as sort of the most important first step in rate reform. Integrated resource planning will allow, if we go back, will allow, as you look at the future projected peak demand points and what type of capacity we need in the grid, it allows the Iowa Utilities Board to require the utilities to come forward and show the kind of the big picture. How do you plan? What is that projected need? And how do you plan on meeting that? Then a well-developed integrated resource planning does that in a transparent process that allows others outside third parties to come forward and propose alternatives that may be less expensive, as reliable or more reliable than what the utility board or what the utilities themselves are proposing. It allows a much more competitive process to determining what our future, how our future energy needs are going to be met, which our current regulatory system doesn't allow. That's a major, major challenge. Integrated resource planning helps address that. By creating that structure, it does create very much a more competitive process. But that structure has to be guided by the Iowa Utilities Board, not just a process that the utilities control. It needs to be a process that stakeholders get to have input in. It has to be transparent, so we can have wide input into that process. And it has to be a process that allows the Iowa Utilities Board to really ensure that investment decisions in the future are made in the best interest of Iowa's ratepayers, as opposed to only being able to consider, as they are today, investments that the utilities propose. The reality is when you look at our different strategies, here I listed again, all 5 of those strategies should be looked at in order to make sure we have the most efficient grid. All of those strategies will need to be invested in at some level, but to the extent we only give the investor-owned utilities the ability to decide which of those 5 strategies will be invested in, then we're really leaving the ratepayers short. And that's critical, especially as we look at those Alliant communities who really are going to need a much more competitive environment from an electric standpoint moving into the future. So we need to find different ways to achieve that. So that kind of is, in a nutshell, a summary of integrated resource planning and why integrated resource planning really forms the foundation for future reforms. Because without that first step, it doesn't really open up the possibilities for us to really change this direction that we're on, where Iowa's communities just cannot afford the current path. So I'm happy to open it up to further questions. I will note that there is legislation was proposed this morning in the Iowa Legislature and the House of Representatives and the Commerce Committee. It would establish a requirement for integrated resource planning under certain conditions. Unfortunately, that bill, as it's currently written, really limits the ability of integrated resource planning to form that foundation for future reform. And Andy, let me just before I take questions, let me go back to the study. I know I'm throwing a lot out at once. Last year, there was a lot of discussion and debate in the legislature on utility regulation. It's a very complicated issue. It makes it very challenging for legislators, because of how complex this is, to really sort out what are the proper next steps. Many of the legislators are concerned with the way the rate increases have been proceeding over the recent history. And so they want to see change. And in fact, Representative Lundgren had proposed a study for the Iowa Utilities Board to really look at rate reform. That study occurred over the summer and in the fall. They hired an outside consultant, independent consultant, London Economics. They helped facilitate a process that involved a wide range of stakeholders. And they came out with a series of recommendations that I've summarized here on this page. I will say the one thing that became clear, and it was really interesting, is that there was uniform support among the business community that were around the table, the business users, the environmental groups, and the Office of Consumer Advocate, that integrated resource planning was a first step that was critical. The second thing that the Utilities Board study identified is that we have what's called advanced rate making, which allows a utility to come in and ask for pre-approval of a large investment. The one thing that the consultants identified is that that process should be aligned with an integrated resource planning, and it needs increased rigor as to ensuring that, in fact, that investment is needed. Number three, we have automatic rate increases built into the system. Certain rate increases have to go to the Iowa Utilities Board to be approved, but they've built in this structure to allow automatic increases. In fact, MidAmerican Energy hasn't been in for a rate increase in 10 years, but their rates have increased by about 25% during that period of time. Number four, they identified there currently are limits in how much energy efficiency and demand response expenditures can be invested by the utilities. But as the one energy consultants report that I mentioned stressed, take demand response, for example, we could have significant savings by incentivizing people during different times other than those 80-hour peak hours of the year. And it's going to be much more expensive to actually build out a structure just to have, all that generation and distribution and transmission to meet just an 80, demand at a very small time of the year. But we have limits on how much demand response as well as energy efficiency can be spent. And the consultant identified that really should be looked at. And you should decide how much energy efficiency spending occurs and how much demand response occurs based more on an economic decision, what's least expensive for the ratepayer, rather than having an arbitrary limit. And then finally, the study recommended an exploration of performance-based rate making. As I mentioned, the current structural flaw is that rates, the profit of an investor-owned utility today is purely based on a percentage of their capital assets. So the only way they can have profits grow in the future is to have more capital assets. But the grid of the future, the efficient, reliable grid of the future, isn't necessarily dependent on a utility having more capital assets, but rather on how well they're using all the energy resources that are currently coming on the grid, whether they own them or third parties own them. And they identified performance-based rate making as starting to be the process where we change that, where you try to have the profit incentives of the utilities more aligned with the ratepayers and more aligned with providing a reliable and efficient grid, not just based on how many assets that they've invested in. So with that, I will wrap up, Andy, and open it up to any questions.
Thanks, Bob. Okay, here's the first question that's in the chat. Could you walk us through a concrete example of IRP using EE, using energy efficiency, that would create a competitive rate or at least improve Alliant rates for ratepayers? And with an example, share how Alliant served communities would benefit by IRP in rate making.
So I am not, first off, I'm not an expert. And unfortunately, since I've been in Iowa, I haven't had the opportunity to go through a rigorous integrated resource planning. By the way, Iowa is one of only 5 states, I believe, that currently are both vertically integrated, meaning we have a kind of a guaranteed geographic territory for a utility, that do not require integrated resource planning. So we're an outlier. But how energy efficiency would come into play, as you look at, and I'm going to go back to meeting this peak demand. There is, this peak demand is for the system as a whole. But there are going to be pockets out there of geographic areas that may be limited because of their distribution and transmission capability and the way they've grown from an energy use standpoint. There's in identifying a really robust integrated resource planning would also do distribution planning. And you'd identify those bottlenecks, and you'd actually do a comparison of, do we have data on certain targeted energy efficiency programs that produce X amount of savings, and what would that cost to implement that program where we have this bottleneck first building out the system? Or that could be done on a statewide base, on the full utility footprint, that they're projecting that they need X percentage more of distribution, transmission, and generation to meet a future need. And it can be shown that certain energy efficiency programs may be more efficient to invest in and could reduce that amount of capital asset that would need to be invested. So it really needs to come down to more of a economic decision rather than just purely a decision made by the utilities, but rather one that the Iowa Utilities Board can have everything on the table and make that and help that decision be made on behalf of the ratepayers as to what is really the least expensive or most or helps reliability the most. I think it's really easy to see on the demand response.
Right.
That's a much more concrete example where right now we have incentives in place. Some of you may have it on your air conditioning, and that's something the Iowa Utilities Board has required of the utilities, but that can be taken to a much higher level and really needs to be.
And I'll just add really briefly to that. In the IRP process, these things are all just called resources. And so if you have a well-designed IRP process, energy efficiency is a resource, and demand reduction is a resource. And they're required to analyze those and look at which is more cost effective. So to reach the peak, the utility might want to invest in a big peaker plant because they're going to get a lot of return on that investment. But it could be a lot more economical to invest instead in customer side efficiency and demand response and get the same outcome. And so that's, theoretically what a good planning process would reveal.
Other states allow third parties, they call them energy syndicators, that will go and aggregate homeowners as well as businesses who agreed to reduce their energy during those peak times by a certain amount. And they are actually able to literally bid into the market to meet that, to provide that need on those peak times. But again, there's an example, a very concrete example that we could open up, make this monopoly process a more competitive process, so we get without having to go to full, retail competition that can allow the ratepayers to benefit.
Thanks. Okay, another question here. I think battery prices are much cheaper and better for the grid if the utilities build them rather than individual homes. Can utilities be incentivized to build batteries?
Well, it's not only less expensive for the utilities today, but that price is even going to go down, or is projected to go down considerably over the next decade. I think a good, strong integrated resource planning process really highlights when that is a value and where that is best a value. And so it can really help to the extent the data shows, it can help, I think, spur that investment into storage in the future.
Okay, I have a quick one here, Bob. I think it might be helpful for everyone to get a little bit of an understanding of how the various dockets work at the utility board, between rate dockets, which the utilities generally bring when they're asking for a rate increase to justify one, and advanced rate making principle dockets, ARP dockets, which they kind of come in and ask for pre-approval at specific rates of return, and then how an integrated resource planning process would fit there. Can you bring those things together?
What people don't, this is kind of let me try to simplify that process. Rates, when like Alliant has a current proposed rate increase request into the Iowa Utilities Board now. So that's that docket. And that's asking for a specific increase. But a part of that decision process for the Utilities Board has already been made from previous advanced rate making dockets. Because part of their request is based on recovering assets that they've built that have been pre-approved. Advanced rate making is the pre-approval process. This was created, it's very unique to Iowa. It was created 20 years ago for a number of reasons. And some of those reasons have probably since passed. But it allows a utility come in and say, okay, we'd like to invest in X amount in either a new gas plant, or where it's been largely used is in wind. The large wind is, this has helped get that started. The challenge at this point is the way the law is set up is the Iowa Utilities Board doesn't get to look at the big picture to the extent they need to. They don't have the utilities long-term plans to understand how this specific investment fits into their long-term plans. It means an advanced rate-making process is a very kind of, the issues are too narrow to really make a good decision. But in that process, they're granting that utility the right to receive, it's been on average 11.5 to 12% return on that investment for the life of that investment, which is from 20 to 30 to 35 years. So that right to that profit is being locked in during the advanced rate making case, but the Utilities Board only has the ability to look at a narrow set of issues in deciding to grant that. Then all of a sudden, when the utility comes in for that rate request, the Utilities Board hands are tied in many ways because they've already approved and said, yes, utility, you're going to get this return on all this investment you made. And that's whether or not the ratepayers actually needed that extra capacity. That's something that we need to keep in mind. Integrated resource planning would ensure that before those advanced rate making cases are made, that this investment actually is needed by the ratepayer and is in the ratepayer's best interest. So that when it's time for that rate increase, we don't have unnecessary investment or an ideal investment, but rather when that investment is happening, we can have a better assurance that it's the ratepayer's best interest. I hope that wasn't too confusing.
Next question. Is the rural community cost of service subsidized by population centers? If so, is there any means to equalize those subsidies across utilities? Is it possible to require utilities to allow spinning off rural assets to RECs, for example?
You know, that's a great question. And there are examples of rural RECs that do things that have a lower rate structure. But having said that, wait, if I caught the first part of the question correctly, yes, because of the historical evolution of our geographic districts, a disproportionate amount of Alliant ratepayers, or no, Alliant ratepayers are paying a disproportionate amount of subsidy to help those rural communities. The MidAmerican customers, which I'm one, I get the benefit of, we don't have to subsidize as many rural residents per ratepayer as Alliant. So the question is, I mean, you know, the good Lord didn't come down and say, this is how it shall be. It just sort of evolved. And so I think it's a good question of, you know, is there a way to start rectifying what really is just a built-in unequalness, unfairness into our, the way we've devised these lands. And that's not going to be, or these geographic districts. That's not going to be an easy solution, because you're going to have, but I think it's a question that needs to be asked. And then was there a second part to that question that I probably didn't answer? Because again, these are great questions with no simple answers.
So the last part of the question was, is it possible to require utilities to allow spinning off rural assets to RECs? And
that would be some really interesting conversations that perhaps should be had, but that's a very complex, that's beyond my, I would encourage that type of dialogue, but I'm not sure what the answers are.
And just to add to that, I think this question gets at some fundamental issues around also showing how important IRP is now, even in the newer sort of energy era and grid era, as we're seeing all this change happening, because traditionally the biggest capital investments, as Bob referred to, that investor-owned utilities get returns on, used to be their big generation plants, coal plants, natural gas plants, et cetera. And to a degree, transmission, if they still own it, which Alliant IPL does not and MidAmerican does in Iowa. But increasingly now in recent rate dockets with IPL, Alliant in Iowa, we have seen that the larger share, or an equal or larger share of total investments, often is being put now in the distribution system. And that's never really been the case in the past. And so, yes, we're seeing these costs potentially skyrocket, and that's a big part of the increases in proposed rates. And while Alliant does have more rural customers than MidAmerican, Alliant still has many times the customers per mile of line, say, than co-ops. And yet their residential rates are higher than every single rural electric co-op in the state, which has way fewer, customers per line and a much more rural grid. So why is it that we're seeing these really, really high investments? Well, the answer to that would come in an IRP process. Why all these proposed investments? Are they really what we need? And that's exactly what IRP would be for. And it's almost impossible to dig into all of that in a regular rate case.
There's a real danger for Alliant communities as the solar and storage is going to continue to decrease in price. So it's going to be easier for large users to basically come off the grid, because the economics, if they're in Alliant territory, is, it just makes that equation and that investment an easier decision, and will be easier as we move forward. So that means you could have more and more of the large users moving off the Alliant grid, which threatens to put a smaller and smaller pool responsible for paying all that infrastructure, which again could even drive rates up further, which then
a vicious cycle
can become a vicious cycle. So that's something for us to be concerned about and keep our eye on.
So I do have a few more questions coming in. As a rooftop solar owner, I'm glad to have net metering, but I'd like Alliant to also have incentive to encourage more people to have solar. I'd be willing to give them 5 to 10% of my excess energy to do that. Would that be enough to change the attitude of a utility?
Well, we'd have to change the way they're allowed to make a profit, because even if you gave them electricity, which they could then resell, the way rates are structured is they wouldn't be able to make a profit on that today. So their incentive is to do things to increase their capital asset base, because it's the only way to increase their profits, the way our current regulatory environment is structured.
Right.
But we really should have a process, which goes back to the integrated resource planning would allow, where we really evaluate when is it less expensive to encourage third-party generation, third-party storage, third-party demand response, rather than building out the system.
Couldn't agree more. Next question. Much of that summer electric use is driven by cooling costs. Wouldn't it make sense to promote ground source geothermal to make cooling take less energy?
Well, there are some strong incentives in the ITC. I think, well, I know I'm personally
Mhm.
involved in one project that's going to be using geothermal. So I think you're going to see expanded use of that.
Yeah, I mean, by the ITC, I mean the federal investment tax credit. Yes, that is.
Oh, yes, that was in the Inflation Reduction Act. Thank you.
Exactly, which extends the 30%, not only for solar and wind, but also for geothermal. So yes, everyone be aware of that. It's a good question. Thanks.
Now, we also have to be aware that while our peak times are in the summer today, we're going to have some additional peak times, or at least it's projected as we move more and more heating to electric. So you'll see some more winter peak
Right,
times as well.
to heat pumps. Yep. Next question. What are the utilities saying to legislators about IRP?
Oh, did you say what are the utilities saying to legislators?
Yes.
Um, from my and the one of the things they say is because they've agreed to do integrated resource planning in their most recent advanced rate making dockets, both MidAm and Alliant. And so one of the things, there's a couple of things they say. One, they say it's an expensive bureaucratic process and we need to make decisions faster than that would allow. That's one of the arguments. The second is that, oh, we're already doing this. Well, the current integrated resource planning, that, if you could call it that, is completely controlled by the utility. The process requires them to listen to stakeholders, but they don't have to take any of that input. And at the end of the day, they have meetings where they listen to ideas. They share some of their concepts if you qualify, and let me explain that in a second. And then they will present a plan of what they plan on doing, but that doesn't have to be approved by the Iowa Utilities Board. There's no ability for there be competitive ideas that are considered and chosen by a non-biased body that's just looking out for the ratepayers. So that's an important distinction. Yes, they are sort of going through a planning process, but it's very weak. Second, it's a closed process. I asked to participate in the Alliant process, but Iowa Business for Clean Energy wasn't involved in that rate docket, and we weren't one of the settling parties, so we can't be part of their planning process. And the MidAmerican process is starting to kick off now, but there's a question how much we're going to be able to participate because they're requiring signing of confidentiality documents. So that's still kind of a discussion. But again, that process shouldn't be controlled by the utilities because they have a certain vested interest that doesn't necessarily align with the ratepayers. That process should be owned and managed by the Iowa Utilities Board so we can have really a vibrant and competitive integrated resource planning process.
And just to add that to that quickly, I mean, Bob mentioned it's a weak process, it's a non-transparent process, but it's really a non-existent process compared to what IRP should be, because this has happened in 3 or 4 recent advanced rate making and rate dockets over recent years, where the board has ordered some form, or there's been a settlement agreement, including a board order for some form of planning, but that's all backwards. Because the point is that planning should be done ahead of time, ahead of the advanced rate making dockets, ahead of the regular rate dockets, so that then we know when we're coming into those dockets that these assets are truly needed. And instead, we're seeing over and over and over again the board saying, wait a minute, we don't really have enough information. We're going to grant this or that or something, but we actually need you to go do some planning, when we know obviously that planning should have been done, 2 years prior as the lead into all of this. So yeah, okay, quick a couple more questions I think we can get to. Which states around the US use IRP, and is distribution system planning included in IRP?
Great question. For the vertically integrated states, not all states have guarantee a geographic market to a utility. There's somewhere in the 17 to 20 range have some type of allowing the user to choose their electric provider. But there are 35, I know that's not adding up to 50, but that number is somewhat changing each year. Somewhere in the 30 to 35 range of states that do have this monopoly system. Of those, I believe it's only 5 that do not require integrated resource planning. So it's easier to tell you which ones don't. Florida, Kentucky, oh gosh. I'm drawing a blank on the other 3. There's a couple other southern states. All the western states either have competitive choice or require integrated resource planning. Again, most of the Northeast, a lot of them have competitive choice or integrated resource planning, or both. And there's just, I think, a handful of states, mainly in the Southeast and Iowa, that do not require IRPs. Kansas was one. I know, my understanding is they are, and from the report, they are requiring integrated resource planning now. But again, that's because 3 years ago, they did their own legislative study that identified integrated resource planning as which would allow a competitive procurement, was the specific recommendation, which helped change their law.
Okay, thanks. And so distribution system planning included in IRP, it ought to be, right, Bob?
I'm sorry, Andy, can you repeat that again?
It was the corollary question here. Is distribution system planning included in IRP?
But in certain states, yes. Distribution planning is more of a newer, more detailed IRP process. But as Andy outlined, it really, especially in the grid that we're moving to with a lot of distributed resources, to get the full benefit, we should start doing our own distribution planning. Should be a component of that. I'm not sure how many states that do IRP have also built in distribution planning at this time.
Right, it is a newer thing, and in some they're wrapping it into the IRP, and in some they're making it a parallel, separate process. So, okay, a couple more questions here we'll fit in before we're done. So, how will the value of solar fit into the IRP? I assume the question refers to the VOS process that might follow net metering in 2027.
Yeah, no, great question. So, yeah, that basically we'll have a study of, what is the value of that distributed energy source. So if we have an IRP process, as we talked about, that should be evaluating what are the different options. And distributed generation is one of those ways to meet our future demand. And now if we have the economic data to say, well, this is what the value of distributed energy generation, then we can make a determination of how that best fits into the overall strategy to meet that peak demand. I might add, I did get a text. The 5 states that do not currently have IRP they are Alabama, Tennessee, West Virginia, Alaska, and Iowa.
Okay, we'll keep rolling. This question is a little bit of a long one, but I'll just read it all. It is usually assumed that the state, i.e. elected officials, utility boards, et cetera, would have the welfare of the consumer and end user in mind. How do we ensure that the politics of, in quotes, predatory delay don't stymie the goals of integrated resource planning, managing climate change, et cetera. And then they go on to define predatory delay as the blocking or slowing of needed change in order to make money off of unsustainable or unjust systems in the meantime. So it's it is not delay from the absence of action, but delay as a plan of action, a way of keeping things as they are for the people who are benefiting now.
Yeah, I think the folks in the system are trying, I think whether it's the utilities board, certainly the consumer advocate, legislators, I believe that, they really want the best for Iowa, and it's complicated. So it's trying to figure that out. How do we get there? And in fact, those, while I often challenge how we're doing things, because I don't think our structure is set up well, that the utilities are incentivized in the right way. It's not because the folks working in the utilities, by and large, they're good people. They're trying to do the best thing. They're trying to do their job the best they can. But we need a structure that ensures the incentives are aligned, so those decisions are in the best interest of the ratepayer. If we can get that right, it'll hopefully help overcome the ability to drag change, the necessary change out. I don't know. It's not going to be easy, and I can't say we're going to be able to, wave a magic wand, and this isn't going to be solved overnight. But the political process, which is involved here, and even the utility regulation process is slow and cumbersome, and we're just going to have to deal with that fact. We just need to ensure that we get the type of reform with which the first step is integrated resource planning. Otherwise, it's going to be hard to get out of the starting block.
Okay, I couldn't agree more. It's a tool the regulators need, and I want to second what Bob just said too. I mean, there's good people throughout the system, and we worked in a lot of dockets at the utility board for many, many years. And we've had really good board and staff. We've had people really with well-intentioned folks there. It does not appear, at least to us, to have been a highly corrupted system at all. But they don't have all the tools they need sometimes. And that's come out in when they've ordered, planning to happen after the fact too often. So integrated resource planning, in a way, is a tool that we do believe that the legislature needs to go ahead and give to the utility board now. That's a tool that's defined as comprehensive and inclusive and transparent and done on a regular cycle. And then that tool would really allow the regulators, the utility board, to be more effective, we think, in the rate regulation portion of their responsibilities.
And I think it allowed the utilities, because I think, their employees are, they want to do what's best as well. So let's create a structure that allows them to succeed, that's correlated with the ratepayers succeeding.
Yes. Okay. Sounds good. Thank you. We are almost at 1, so really appreciate everyone joining us today, and really appreciate you, Bob. Thanks for joining us. Any words of wisdom as we sign off? You've said them all. Okay. Thanks again, everyone. We will post, we're recording. We'll go ahead and post a recording of this. So if you have folks you know of who wanted to hear, go ahead and let them know that we'll distribute that link shortly.
Andy, I will say, I do encourage you to have conversations with your policymakers on the importance of both integrated resource planning and setting the foundation for rate reform. That's in the ratepayers' interest.
Agreed. Thanks, Bob. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Andy.
Bye.